Welcome to Catholic Feedback. I'm your host, Keith Nestor. On this podcast, we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith with everyday life. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Down to Earth Ministry, a ministry of stewardship, a mission of faith, and by the generous support of our patrons. For more information, please visit downtoearthministry.org. That's down, the number 2, earthministry.org. Let's get to it. Well, welcome, friends. So excited to have you all here with me and another adventurous episode of Catholic Feedback Live. I love doing these live stream episodes. To me, they're kind of scary because if I say something stupid, which I probably do, I can't go back and edit it. I thought about releasing like an outtake version of when I record these by myself because I'm always going, oh, that was dumb, and then go back and fix that. I'm sure nobody else has ever done that before. But when we're live, it just is what it is. And I'm super pumped tonight to be able to welcome an incredible guest to talk about this idea of traditional Catholicism and what that's all about, my friends. What is traditional Catholicism? And tonight, joining me in the podcast is Mr. Michael Lofton. So, Michael, how you doing, man?
Good. How are you, Keith?
I'm doing great. Welcome to Catholic Feedback.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
This is a podcast where we connect the eternal truths of the Catholic faith to everyday life. And when I've been watching your YouTube channel, Reason and Theology, I really like just that idea of what it means, reason and theology, because we got to have both. And for me, the whole idea of having a reason for our theology and thinking about it reasonably, I mean, that's practicality, that's real life. And what I want to see happen with our podcast here is for the topics that we discuss to really help people not just know stuff, but know how it applies to their life and live stuff, right? And so I love what you're doing, and I'm excited that you're here tonight to talk about this idea of traditional Catholicism. So
hey, I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about your journey to Catholicism. I watched one of your streams once, and I didn't know this, but you were Catholic, then Orthodox, then Catholic again. Is that the right order?
Yeah, but even prior to Catholicism, I had some other experiences that led me to Catholicism. So I wasn't a cradle Catholic or anything like that. And I could talk about, the process up to Catholicism, or we could talk about from after Catholicism, or whatever you want.
Well, I would love to just kind of hear a summary of that to know how it is you got to be doing what you're doing.
Well, the quick version is that, I was born here in the United States, but really early on, my parents moved to Israel, and we're doing some Christian missionary work there. So I had a little bit of exposure to Christianity, but that was from ages 2 to 4. My mother divorced my father around age 4 and returned back to the United States. She eventually converted to Judaism. So around the age of 7, she brought us back to Israel, but this time to practice Judaism. So I did that from ages 7 to 12. Didn't really know what I was practicing, but hey, I was told, hey, here's what you're going to do, and here's what you believe, and I did it. At the age of 12, returned to the United States once again, but this time moved in with my father, and he was kind of a charismatic, non-denominational Christian at the time, and so I really began to be exposed to Christianity at that point, at an age where I can start to understand what it was, and started going to church with him, and I was baptized. So at the age of 12, became a Christian, but during my teens, fell away, as most people do. So it was around the age of 19, I decided, let me just move to New York City. I want to see what the big life is like. So moved out there on my own, and started to live a pretty sinful life, unfortunately. And it was around the age of 22 that I was just kind of at the end of my ropes. And I remember praying a prayer effectively to the effect that I said, okay, I'm 22 years old. I'm not going to do another 22 more years. So God, you need to intervene in my life because I don't want to live anymore. And he did just that. There was a guy who right around that time gave me a Bible It was a really, really nice study Bible, hardback. And I was so impressed by the fact that somebody just came up to me randomly and gave me a Bible, and such a nice Bible too, and that they cared enough about my soul to do this, because I'm just a random person, and here they are giving me a $40, $50 Bible. I
Wow.
was really impressed by that. So I said, you know what? I don't have anything else to do with my life at this point. Let me just read this thing. And I did that. In about
Cool.
less than a month, I read it cover to cover, and it profoundly changed my life. From that point on, there was a very, very significant 180 in my life where I began to take the faith very, very seriously. And just kind of from that point on, I began to study through theology and kind of made my way from non-denominational to Baptist, and dived in a little bit to the Reformed faith. And at the time I also had to consider, okay, well, I have a daughter on the way. Do I baptize her or not? So I had to begin considering the question of infant baptism, and that eventually led me to Presbyterianism because they baptize infants. And when I was in Presbyterianism, one of the things that they were really focused on, not only theology, but is church history and an emphasis on the historic faith. And so I started studying church history, and I started seeing a lot of discontinuity between what I was reading in the church fathers, especially the apostolic fathers, and started noticing a lot of discontinuity between it and the Reformed faith. And so, long story short, I realized, okay, I need to get into something that's a little bit more traditional, that has apostolic succession. And of course, my options at the time, I believed, were Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism. Well, Anglicanism was out the door for me, pretty much from the very beginning, because the only conservative Anglicans that were even nearby are the ones who are in communion with parishes that have women priests. And I realized how novel that was in ecclesiology. So I immediately knew, okay, that's not an option. So it boiled down to Orthodoxy and Catholicism for me. And Catholicism won the day, even though I was somewhat anti-Catholic back then. Catholicism won the day because I realized you needed to have a magisterium, especially the papacy. You needed to be able to identify what is an ecumenical council, and how does the church teach infallibly, and things like that. And so the Catholic Church won the day for me. So in 2012, I converted to Catholicism. As I was in the Catholic Church, there were all kinds of scandals that were happening not only around me, but were happening to me. In other words, there were people who were doing very, very hurtful things, priests and other people who attended my parish. And, without going into details, there was a lot of things that happened that I should have never had to go through as a Catholic, but unfortunately I did. And a lot of it scandalized me. And I continued to do my best to persevere. But after about 5 years, I became so fatigued with dealing with all of the mess that I said, you know what, I need to maybe take a second look at Eastern Orthodoxy, because practically this just isn't working out. And maybe this is God's way of telling me that I made the wrong choice. And so I started looking into Orthodoxy for a while, and I eventually converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. But as I was, Eastern Orthodox, I began to realize that a lot of the problems that I was experiencing in the Catholic Church, I began to experience in Eastern Orthodoxy. And at the end of the day, the words of the Second Vatican Council, where it talks about you can't be saved if you know that the Catholic Church was established by Christ, if you fail to enter it or remain within it. Those last words, remain within it, continued to go through my head for quite a while, for several years. And the more I studied the issues between East and West, the more I realized, the Catholic Church just, it makes sense objectively. Yeah, I had a really lot of bad experiences, subjectively speaking, but objectively, the Catholic Church makes more sense. It checks out with the data that I see in the first millennium. It truly does seem to be the church instituted by Christ. So no matter what my subjective experiences are, subjective things aren't going to determine truth, because you could have a really bad experience in the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church would still be established by Christ if it was something instituted by Christ. And likewise with Orthodoxy, you could have a really bad time in Orthodoxy, but that doesn't mean Orthodoxy isn't true. Ultimately, to determine which one is true, we're going to have to go to objective claims, objective truth claims. And I just realized the more and more I studied things, Catholicism had that edge over Orthodoxy. So in late 2019, early 2020, I entered back into communion with Rome. So
wow.
Yeah. So that's in a nutshell. There's so much more to it. But
well, the thing that strikes me about that is you can study, you can learn, you can have all of that. But at the end of the day, when we practice our faith, those experiences that we have with people and those personal touch points that the church has with us, they're so important. And I've always just felt it was so, I don't know, just diabolical when people say things to me like, well, I hate the Catholic Church because of what happened to my family, or because of what happened to me, or because of what happened to someone I know. To me, that's just hard, because the power of experience can sometimes override what we know to be true, objectively speaking, because we all want to live in this place with God. And if where we live in the Catholic Church doesn't feel good, and I'm not talking about like some kind of touchy-feely thing, but if it's like really, really difficult because you've got people who are against you, and that's your faith experience, that can have some serious ramifications.
Especially as a parent. I mean, just let me give just a practical example. I'm not saying this is what happened to me, but I'm just throwing this out as a practical example. If you're a father and one of your children is harmed by a Catholic priest, that's going to impact the way you perceive the Catholic Church. It might still be true that the Catholic Church is instituted by Christ. All of the objective truth claims might still apply.
Yeah.
But that emotional barrier is going to sometimes override your intellect. And sometimes the scandal there could be so strong that it causes a person, I'm not saying excusably, but it does cause a person to begin to look elsewhere. Again, well, I am not saying excusably, but understandably, it does.
Which ultimately, I think we all need to hear that, because we need to have grace for people that have been through hell in whatever church they're coming from.
Right.
And I know that for a lot of times people just want to be like, well, it doesn't matter what you've gone through, you should still be Catholic. And again, you and I can agree on the fact that objectively speaking, the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church, and it's the true church, no matter what bad things happen by human beings that are a part of it.
Sure.
But when it's our kids, when it's our experience, like what you went through, when it's a tough thing, sometimes we have to allow people to process those things.
Sure.
And, have grace and understanding. And I think that's kind of important for sort of moving into this idea that I want to talk about with traditional Catholicism, because here's what I've noticed. Mm-hmm. I've been Catholic for about 3 years now, maybe a little bit more. I came here in 2017. So in October, and I had no idea. And I'd been on this journey for a long time to come out of Protestantism into Catholicism. And I had no idea that there was this division within the Catholic Church, and there was this thing called traditional Catholicism and, modernism, or what. I don't even know if there's a real name for it or whatever. I mean, you hear a lot of things said like, oh, well, those are the Novus Ordo people, or those are the modernists, or those are the what, but that was kind of new to me. And I thought that like I was becoming Catholic. That's traditional, right? Like I am in the traditional Catholic, because to me that was like, well, duh, aren't all Catholics traditional? So when I found this, it's sort of been like a little bit, I don't want to use the word scandalous, but it's been a little weird. It's been a little weird for me.
Yeah.
A guy who used to be a Protestant pastor who became Catholic because he wanted unity and truth and everyone to just, hold hands and sing songs. Right. That's what we all think when we become Catholic. But some of the things that I've noticed has just been like really, really interesting. And so I want to talk about that with you tonight, because I know that that's when I've seen you, and that's kind of the stuff that you're known for right now, is talking about these traditional things. And of course, as Orthodox, that's pretty traditional. Catholics, pretty traditional. But like, and I want to talk about reason and theology a little bit later, but many new Catholics hear this term traditional Catholics. But let's just break it down for those people in here who, because a lot of people that listen to me and are in my channel, they aren't like the people who are, not everybody, of course, but they're not like the ones that are geeking out over like all the councils and things like that. A lot of my listeners are people who are cradle Catholics, or are thinking about becoming Catholics, converts, reverts, but they're people who are like into the practical things. So let's talk for a minute about, practically speaking, when people talk about traditional Catholicism, what is that?
It's sad that we even have to make these kinds of distinctions. Like you said, you come from Protestantism, you enter the church, you're Catholic, right? Why do we have to put all these qualifiers on here? I was actually talking to a TV station yesterday, because I'm trying to get some of the shows on a TV station, and he was a Protestant, who owns the company. And so he asked, I told him I was Catholic, and he asked me, "Oh, well, what kind of Catholic are you?" And here I go thinking, why do we even have to have this thing where, what kind of Catholic are you? Conservative, liberal, traditional? What are you? Well, a traditional Catholic, of course, there's going to be different definitions, but just broadly speaking, a traditional Catholic is going to be somebody who recognizes that the Catholic Church as it exists today is supposed to be in continuity with 2,000 years of church history. In other words, any changes and any reforms that may have happened in the last 50 or so years are to be integrated and to be in continuity with the past prior to 50 years ago, namely the Second Vatican Council, right? That's generally where people are going to say there tended to be some pretty significant reforms. So a traditional Catholic is going to say, whatever we have today in the church, it needs to be reconciled with Vatican I, and it needs to be reconciled with the Council of Trent. It needs to be reconciled with, things going back to the Council of Nicaea. In a nutshell, that's effectively what it is. Now, you can start adding more qualifiers to that, and some traditional Catholics do. They might say that a traditional Catholic is one who's committed to the Latin Mass, the Tridentine Mass, as opposed to the Novus Ordo liturgy. Some traditional Catholics might define themselves that way. Other traditional Catholics wouldn't necessarily say that you have to go to a Latin Mass to be a traditional Catholic. So there's going to be disputes on what exactly a traditional Catholic is, but to the best that I can define it, it's at least going to be somebody who says the church didn't just happen 50 years ago. It's something that has been around for 2,000 years, and there can't be any major contradictions between what it is now and what it was, say, 50 years or before. I'll go.
But it isn't like joining the Knights of Columbus or something like that, right? You don't there's no organization out there that is like, okay, well, if you want to be a traditional Catholic, send your information and $50 to this, whatever. And then you get your traditional Catholic card. It's more of it seems to me like it's kind of more of a culture or a tribe within Catholicism. But okay, so who's in charge of this traditional Catholicism?
There's nobody in charge of it. And again, it depends on who you ask, because some are going to say that you have to belong to one of these Latin Mass groups to even qualify as a traditional Catholic. But then there's no one who's in charge of it all per se. That can grant you this traditional Catholic card. It's more how you identify, how you see yourself. And it's generally being done, I'm a traditional Catholic as opposed to a liberal Catholic, as opposed to somebody who thinks that you can be a Catholic and pro-choice.
Oh, okay.
So that's sometimes how the term is used. At other times, it's used to say, well, I'm a traditional Catholic insofar as I go to a Latin Mass and I'm not one of those Novus Ordo people.
Okay.
So that's it, just kind of depends on who you're talking to.
So, okay. So I go to the Latin Mass. Like, we have a Latin Mass at my parish, and We discovered it maybe, I don't know, 6 months into being Catholic, and just absolutely fell in love with it.
Yeah.
But when I came to the Latin Mass, I noticed that there's a different culture there. It's not just about, oh, I prefer this liturgy. Because, I mean, back in my Protestant days, we had different types of worship services. We had a blended worship service, we had a traditional worship service, and we had a contemporary worship service. And people would kind of go depending on what kind of music they liked or their friends. But it was still basically the same thing, But when I go to the Latin Mass, what I've noticed is it feels like a different universe, even from, the Novus Ordo Mass. And the church I go to is pretty conservative church, no matter what. So I go to the Latin Mass. Does that automatically make me a traditional Catholic because I go there?
In the eyes of some Catholics, it would. In the eyes of others, they would say that's not good enough. Some are going to say, not only do you need to go to a Latin Mass, but you also need to basically anathematize the Novus Ordo, or you need to also embrace the third secret of Fatima and their particular nuances that they have to it, or you need to pray the rosary every day, or you need to use this or that missal, or you need to belong to this or that chapel. So it's just going to really depend on who you talk to. But yeah, some would say, yeah, you're a traditional Catholic. Others would say you're not traditional enough.
So, okay, let me ask you a question here on the spot, right here on Catholic Feedback. Michael Lofton, are you a traditional Catholic?
I would say yes, I'm a traditional Catholic, but we need to properly define what that means, because some people are going to hear that term and think it means one thing as opposed to another. I'm a traditional Catholic as far as the first definition that I gave to you.
Yeah.
Which is, of course, that we need to be able to recognize that the church where it is today, it can't teach just something entirely novel. It needs to be in continuity with the past. So we need to be in continuity with the faith of our fathers. And I'm also a traditional Catholic insofar as I really admire and appreciate the Latin Mass. I don't anathematize the Novus Ordo. I do actually think that there are some things that needed to be reformed about the Latin Mass. So I'm actually on board with the idea that there needed to be a reform of the liturgy, which is really what the fathers at Vatican II were aiming for. But at the same time, I don't go so far as to say I agree with all the reforms that came after Vatican II on the liturgy. I think there were some reforms that were okay, and there are some reforms that no, they haven't really been the best, and we could learn from some aspects of the Latin Mass. Yet I also don't see the Latin Mass as the end all and be all of liturgy. So I'm a very qualified and nuanced kind of traditional Catholic.
Well, I appreciate that. Somebody asked me that question one time recently. They said, "Keith, are you a traditional Catholic?" And I had to sit back and think about it. And here was my answer. I said, yes, I am, but it's not because I go to the Latin Mass. It's not because I am, necessarily conservative, which I am in my theology. It's not because I prefer traditional worship music over contemporary worship music. Mm-hmm. It's because I think the most traditional thing that we can do as Catholics is be obedient to the church.
Exactly.
Because obedience to the church is what, in my view, okay, in my view, obedience to the church is what defines traditional Catholicism. Because otherwise, you're basically Protestant again. Because when you start talking about, well, it's kind of this way for some people, and they kind of think of it like that. In my mind, I go, well, that just sounds like what I used to live in, where everybody had their own little worlds and they just separated. But then when you ask the question, who's in charge? Nobody really knows.
You're bringing up a really important point here. Especially it's important to me because of the work I'm doing on the magisterium. One tendency that I've noticed among some who identify as traditional Catholic is dissent from the current magisterium. They would see the current magisterium as entirely antithetical to pre-conciliar magisterium, the magisterium prior to the Second Vatican Council. Yeah. So they're going to basically say, I affirm the magisterium. I just affirm the magisterium prior to Vatican II, and I don't believe any of the stuff that's going on after Vatican II, and I don't adhere to the current magisterium. That's not traditional, because that is creating such a rupture and state of discontinuity in the church that it really discredits itself and is basically just the conservative side of the same thing that the liberals are saying. The liberals are saying the same thing, that after Vatican II, there's all this kind of rupture and discontinuity with the past, but they just like the rupture as opposed to the some of these traditional Catholics where they'll say the same thing. They just don't like the rupture. I hold to neither. I don't believe that there's any substantial ruptures in doctrine with the current magisterium. I do believe that we are to be in submission to the current magisterium, and that is extremely important when it comes to the definition of whether or not you're really an authentic traditional Catholic. You can't say that I'm going to affirm the teaching authority of the past, but I can completely thumb my nose at anything taught today, and I don't assent to anything taught by the current magisterium unless it's ex cathedra. That's not traditional Catholicism. Nobody in the past, prior to the Second Vatican Council, nobody would have recognized that as traditional. They would have said that is extremely novel. You're in very, very dangerous and even sinful territory if you continue in that direction. That's anything but traditional.
Yeah, I mean, to me, what that sounds like is, I don't want to say every heresy ever, but I mean, when you think about a lot of the major heresies in the past, you're talking about not people who come from the outside. Remember, heresy is comes from it begins within. So when you have, and just take, let's say, Arianism for whatever, you've got this priest who is within the magisterium of the church who begins to diverge from it to teach his own special doctrine. And of course, that's where you see that road towards heresy and division and schism is when you say, I'm not going to follow this current magisterium. It's not just happening right now. This has been happening for 2,000 years. And when we look back on it, and we always go, "Oh yeah, those heretics, they left the safety of the church." But do we run the risk in some circles of wanting to do the same thing? Maybe not even like explicitly at first, but sort of implicitly with our constant disdain for anything that comes from Rome.
You're bringing out a really important point. The Eastern Orthodox, when they rejected the Council of Florence and the reconciliation there, of course, they initially accepted it, but later on rejected it. When they rejected it, I mean, they were doing so under the guise of simply accepting the traditional faith and what the church has always believed. Luther was doing the exact same thing. Luther didn't think that he was in discontinuity with the past. He believed that he was very much in continuity with the tradition, and it was Rome who was going astray from the tradition. In a qualified sense, on some things that was true, and that's why the Counter-Reformation was brought about, to balance some of those things out. But he just took it too far, where he just saw this substantial rupture with the papacy, and so he was definitely wrong there. But of course, he was going to say that, hey, I'm in continuity with the past, and so pretty much everybody out there who has left the church and gone astray, gone into schism, or gone into heresy, has thought that they were traditional. And there is definitely a schismatic mentality among some, not all, some traditional Catholics whenever they begin to say that I really can just ignore whatever's going on with the current magisterium. I just need to look to the past. I need to just look at the catechisms prior to Vatican II. I just need to look at all of the stuff prior to Vatican II and ignore everything afterwards, and I'll be safe. There is an element of material, at least a material element to schism. Maybe they're not a formal schismatic yet, but they're leaning in that direction of schism because it is not recognizing the current magisterium. And then that schism ultimately is also going to end up leading to heresy. It always does. Nobody ever just remains a schismatic. When they become a schismatic, it then tends towards heresy afterwards.
So let me tell you about something that was interesting to me. When I was researching Catholicism, watching YouTube videos, learning about things, I would see some, and I'm not going to say any names because I'm not going to give anybody any airtime here with this, sure, but I would see videos from certain, what seemed to me to be Catholic channels and organizations that talked about Catholic things, but then when I dug a little bit deeper, I'm like, wait a second, these guys aren't these guys are telling me that, the Pope really isn't the Pope, and we don't have a valid Pope. And I mean, I'm talking about sedevacantists, okay? Which for those of you that don't know what that means that the chair of Peter is empty, seda meaning chair, vacant meaning empty. And they have this belief that, I don't know if was it starting in the Second Vatican Council, or that we don't have a pope right now, and I mean, it goes that far, doesn't it? In some kind instances.
It mostly came about beginning in the 70s. So really after the liturgical reform. So not exactly right at the time of the Second Vatican Council, but just a little bit later. And I think that's partly because of the fact that we did very poorly in implementing the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. We could have done a lot better. And if we had done better, there would have never been an occasion for the Sedevacantists to come about. But because things were done at sometimes very poorly and with very sometimes even scandalous appearances, it did just that. It scandalized a lot of people, and they began to ask, okay, well, how can the current claimant to the throne of the papacy actually be the Pope? How could the Pope really do this? So this idea that, well, he really isn't the Pope began to come around, Sedevacantism. And of course, to an extent, we all believe Sedevacantism, insofar as if a Pope were to die, you don't immediately have a successor. You have to have the College of Cardinals elect a successor. So there is a period where we believe the see is vacant. But the difference between us and the Sedevacantists, substantially speaking, because there's all kinds of different Sedevacantists, but the fundamental difference is they're going to see the period of Sedevacantism. It can be this very long period, 50, 60 years or more without a pope, whereas a faithful Catholic prior to the Second Vatican Council would have thought that is the most novel thing that you could ever say. That's anything but traditional. And it's hard to square that with some of the things that are even also taught by the First Vatican Council. So traditional Catholics are going to say that no, the current Pope actually is the Pope. He's not just a claimant. He really is the Pope. But the Sedevacantists is going to say, no, he's not. So
okay, I got a question for you about Sedevacantists, and then we can move on.
Mm-hmm.
Do they have in their mind like an idea that someday there will be a new Pope and we're going to get back to whatever? Or are they just kind of like, no, the end of the world is coming before that?
There's different Sedevacantists out there with different views, but the majority views seems to be that, yes, there will be some kind of restoration. Now, that restoration could come about from the very last few bishops who are valid bishops in their opinion, because they believe everybody who has been ordained under the new rite is not a valid bishop. And
Right.
There's very few individuals still left that have that kind of succession. So that haven't been ordained in the new rite when it comes to the Latin Church. So they would maybe say that there's going to be some kind of restoration there with those few bishops, or that Peter himself is going to come down from heaven and ordain a new pope at some point. So there's different views out there.
Okay. All right. We don't need to spend a ton of time on that. It may come up later. I know people are going to have questions, and we're going to get to that. And I know some people are going to want to do that, but another question about terms. Okay. What's a rad trad?
It's a radical traditionalist. Yeah, radical traditionalist. And of course, you're going to get different definitions here because there's no official dictionary that defines any of this, right? So it is somewhat subjective. But at least in the way that I perceive radical traditionalists is going to be somebody who is dissenting from the current magisterium, who has an overemphasis on certain private revelations and prophecies, who has a poor understanding of the teaching authority of the church, who thinks that they're maintaining the traditional faith when they're engaging in quite a few novelties. Somebody who is maintaining an ecclesiology that really undermines the indefectibility of the church, that seems to suggest that the church is defective. Although they would never claim that the church is defective, their views would logically follow and lead to that position. That's the way I understand a radical traditionalist. And I would add another definition, another qualifier to that definition. They would see the Latin Mass as pretty much the only option, and that the Novus Ordo is possibly evil. Some will use that term, that it's evil. Others will say, no, it just doesn't offer as much grace as the Latin Mass. I don't think either one of those positions are tenable.
Okay, so we got traditional Catholics, we got radical traditional Catholics, and then I've heard another term too, reactionary radical traditional Catholics. It's
Right.
confusing, man. It just, like, for somebody who just wants to be Catholic and love Jesus and receive the sacraments and be at peace in Christ's church, all these different, and I listen, I get the whole, there's liberals and there are conservatives. I get that. I get that there are people, but to me, you know how I view that, Michael? I view that as this, and boy, if I offend you out there, maybe it's okay if I offend you saying this, but here, not you personally, Michael, but anybody watching who is more liberal, I just look at it like this: you're either someone who follows the teaching of the church or you're not, And to me, it's like my expectation, my experience is that the people who tend to be more devoted to following the teaching of the church tend to be people who are maybe at first like drawn into some of this traditional stuff because they think that's where it feels more appreciated. I mean, I struggle. I don't get liberal Catholicism. Like, I don't get it. I don't understand people who are in the Catholic Church and willingly come against the teachings of the church when it comes to social issues and different theological things or whatever. And they're just like, no, we want to have women priests and we're going to freak out until we do. Or we want to redefine marriage and we're going to freak out until it's like, no, dude, you're not Catholic. Like, that's so to me, I just kind of have always just said it like, well, you're either Catholic or you're not. But now there seems to be all these other different layers to it. And sometimes it gets a little difficult because here's what I've noticed, like in the YouTube world. Okay. Maybe you've been here too. It feels like everybody wants to figure out which camp you're in so they can either like you or hate you based on whether you fit into a certain tribe of whatever. And I'm just not about that, man. I don't want anything to do with that. But I love my Catholic faith, and I learn from lots of different types of people, So I guess, do you see, like, what are some of the dangers that are associated with getting too far into this idea of radical traditionalism or whatever you want to call it? I mean, what can happen?
And I think you have the focus in the right place, and that is whether or not you're assenting to the magisterium. That's ultimately what this boils down to, because some of these discussions are really peripheral and they're not defining. They don't break communion or anything like that. They don't really determine whether or not you're a faithful Catholic. But some of the dangers that you mentioned with maybe radical traditionalism is, I think, if you carry some of the views to their conclusion, you would end up leaving the Catholic Church. You would end up going sedevacantism, which is outside of the Catholic Church. You would end up going to Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism or something else. So I think schism is definitely a danger there. And I also agree with you. I don't really try to define myself by any of these categories. And that's what confuses a lot of people. They try to fit me into their boxes and their categories, and I don't fit, because there are some things about the Eastern Rite churches that are fully Catholic that I would say are a little bit better, prudentially speaking, than some of the things that we find in the Latin Rite. So to every Latin Catholic, I sound Eastern. To every Eastern Christian, I probably sound Latin. To every liberal, I'm going to sound conservative. To every conservative, I might sound a little liberal. To every radical traditionalist, I'm going to sound modernist. To every modernist, I'm going to sound like a traditionalist. I don't fit in anybody's camp because I make a lot of qualifications and distinctions, and I recognize that the faith can be a little bit broader than some of these categories. That being said, I do think that what it boils down to, however, is, are you faithful to obey and assent to the things that you are required to obey and assent to? If the answer is yes, you're a faithful Catholic. If the answer is no, you are not a faithful Catholic and you need to repent. And that's ultimately where the focus really needs to be.
Yeah. And I know we could do a whole series of shows about the dangers of, modernism and liberalism and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And I really don't talk about that a whole lot because to me, it's not worth it. Because I'm done with that part of my life. You know what I mean? Like, I'm done with living outside of this authority of Christ and his church. So I don't want to like that was the battle I fought all the time in my Protestantism. You know, I was in the Methodist church. I was a pastor in the Methodist church, and the liberalism that was there was so out of control that I would literally have conversations with people, you know, pastors, and say, look, we can't do this. This isn't biblical. This isn't historical. This isn't traditional. This isn't anything. And they're basically saying, they would say to me things like, well, Keith, you know, your understanding of the Bible and of the church's understanding of the Bible for 2,000 years has just been wrong, you know, and we're here to fix it. We need to, and to me, I was just like, oh, I can't live in that world. So that's why I became Catholic. And so I don't even really go there, but I know that we could talk about that. And that's not really what we're here to talk about tonight. But I mean, I guess people can ask questions, but I want to know what your goal is with Reason and Theology. Like, is that connected to this idea of traditional Catholicism, or is that just sort of something that's come up lately for you?
There's a lot of goals, and it has somewhat come up lately because of different things that I'm noticing. A big thing for me is to focus on the magisterium and the different ways in which it teaches and the levels of assent owed to it. So the degrees of obligation of assent, because I think that there's on both sides, some traditionalists and some, and pretty much all of the liberals and modernists, there's a problem of dissent. And so discussing the different degrees of obligations of assent is very important. And also just properly interpreting what the church teaches, all that is related to the magisterium. So that's a really big focus of the show. But also, of course, dialogue with Eastern Orthodox to bring them to Catholicism. That's something that I haven't seen a whole lot of when it comes to the online scene. So that was one of the focuses initially that I had with the show, and still have and will continue to have with the show. Speaking to Eastern Orthodox. In fact, when I started the show, I was still Eastern Orthodox.
Really? I didn't know that.
I was very interested in having discussions between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox because I felt that these are necessary discussions that really aren't being conducted online, not very well, at least. So I wanted to provide a platform that has those discussions, and I still have it. But I now especially see the need to call those Eastern Orthodox to communion with the Catholic Church. And so there definitely is a big focus there. But of course, also calling Protestants to communion and, speaking to Mormons and Muslims and atheists and people like that. That's also a focus of the show. Having debates, roundtable discussions, interviews, commentary and analysis. I try to do a little bit of everything, but the big ones are balancing out some of the traditionalists who are going too far, that's going to end up leading into schism, and then correcting some of the dissent that we see there from the liberals, and also calling some of those Eastern Orthodox to communion with Catholicism. Those are kind of the big focuses.
Well, it's good that you have, plenty of things to do with that, because that's a lot. I mean,
I know.
When I think about that, it's like, man, there's so many different elements and aspects to this, and to me, becoming Catholic was about taking a break from all of the making my head explode type of stuff, and I'm by nature, Michael, I'm a guy that I love to debate. I love to dig into things, but I tend to not want to do that now as a Catholic, because I guess I feel like I'm home.
And that's fine.
Yeah.
And everybody has their own focus and purpose. That's perfectly fine. I don't think everybody should have the exact same goal, because I think that what God does is he gifts people for different purposes. And so I think that's actually good, what you're focusing on. For me, I just noticed that there was a great deficiency there with engaging Eastern Orthodoxy. And there's also a deficiency in correcting some of these excesses there in the traditional Catholic world. I think there's a whole lot of people out there engaging the liberals, so I don't do that as much. There's a very few engaging some of the excesses of traditional Catholicism, so I've been doing that a little bit more as well.
Well, I think it's awesome. I think we all need each other. We all need our different focuses and our different things. And I certainly, I love doing that. But what's ironic for my situation is, even though that's kind of where I am, that's what I do all the time. Like, I am always finding myself in debates and in arguments and in back and forth with people who just want to go there. So that's what I do. But like, it's, to me, I feel like I wish that there weren't so many different tribes in the Catholic Church that are opposed to each other. I'm totally cool with different emphasis and different kind of tribal things, like, and when I say tribe, that's kind of a weird word, but I think you guys know what I mean. I just mean, like, we're all Catholic, but I'm into this thing, you're into that thing, which is great. But to me, when we start turning on each other and criticizing each other and going after each other and focusing always on negative and tearing people down, like, that's when I kind of go, all right, everybody just needs to understand this. For the people on the outside that are looking at all of us Catholics that are fighting with each other and ripping on each other all the time, that does not bode well for now turning around and arguing with Protestants about why they need to be part of Christ's one holy Catholic Apostolic Church.
Sure.
So anyway, that was, for me, that's been a big deal. But we have to have answers. We have to be able to engage with those who come to us and say, "Oh, you guys are crazy," and I think that's important. And we've got to keep pushing forward what the church teaches, and faithfulness to the magisterium. And that's just kind of where I'm at with it.
And similarly along those lines, I have a lot of people who I've noticed it, or they'll bring it up, where they will use, for example, a lot of the Eastern Orthodox, they'll use the very arguments that are taking place in the Catholic Church today against Catholicism to lead people away. They'll say, look at all this chaos going on. Look at all of these debates that y'all are having, or look at this stuff. It undermines your ecclesiology. You need to come to the Eastern Orthodox. And I'm seeing this stuff, and I'm hearing some of the excesses of some traditional Catholics that is lending itself to people leaving the church. And I'm saying, wait, we need to address this, because the Eastern Orthodox are using this against us. So I kind of have that focus in mind as well, because I see that it's leading people away from Christ. At the same time, I'm also considering, some of the things that are being said in the Catholic Church. It not only undermines our ecclesiology. For anybody who's Protestant who's listening to this, they're going to say, well, why should I even be a Catholic? If what you're saying is true, why should I be a Catholic? And I'm trying to balance some of that out so that an Orthodox can listen, a Protestant can listen in, and even a confused Catholic can listen in and hear a voice of reason that makes sense, and it's consistent with all of these different concerns. Because what I've noticed is, some Catholics only have a focus on one particular area, and it might engage the Protestants, but it doesn't sufficiently engage Orthodox. Likewise, you might have somebody who's engaging the Orthodox, but it doesn't sufficiently account for some of the concerns of the Protestants. I'm trying to call people to a balanced approach that addresses everyone's concerns, because ultimately I believe that the truth is consistent. And so if I'm using argumentation that, it might refute the Protestants, but it undermines me later on when I'm having discussions with the Orthodox, it's not good argumentation, because it's not consistent. So I'm trying to balance that out. That's why I take a very nuanced and qualified approach.
Well, it's really hard to do. It's really hard to do. And I feel like there are so many things I love about the more, traditional aspects of the Catholic faith. And when I say traditional, again, you remember what I'm talking about: obedience to the Catholic Church. But for me personally, like, I just love, I love the Latin Mass. I love the Gregorian chant. I love the idea of the priest not facing me, but facing the east. There's so many of these things that I have experienced and come to understand why they're there. They're just so beautiful,
Sure.
But at the same time, I don't want that to mean that I have to now, like, tell other people that what they're doing is wrong,
Yeah.
Anyway,
And I get it. I think it's important to be aware of what some of the other people's concerns are, what the Protestant concern is, what the Orthodox concern is, what some concerns are for various Catholics out there. If you're familiar with all of them, you can take a pretty balanced approach, because you're gonna know, well, how would the Orthodox hear this? How would some of the liberals hear this? How would the Protestants hear this? You can kind of take these into account and come with a, nuanced approach.
Awesome. All right, let's take some questions. You up for that?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So those of you out here in the chat, let's try to keep this relatively on topic. But Michael and I are willing to take questions. He's a lot smarter than I am, so I'll probably end up going, I don't know, Michael. But let's see what we got out there, my friends. We've got a good audience here on Catholic Feedback tonight. So I'm gonna do my best to catch a lot of these questions. So if you've got one and it's relatively on topic, fire away. So while we're waiting for some questions to come in, Michael, why don't you tell us what you're excited about? Like when you wake up in the morning and you're ready to go make a live stream or talk about stuff, like what's on your mind right now?
What's exciting to me is the feedback that I've been getting. I have a lot of people saying that, hey, I came to the Catholic Church because of what y'all are doing, or you really helped prevent me from leaving the Catholic Church. You gave me hope. You're really helping me out here because I was very spiritually confused. Or somebody emailed me earlier today, and I was able to help them, encourage them to go to the sacrament of confession. And so awesome. Those things are encouraging, because I know that lives are being changed. People are growing closer to God by his grace. So, I mean, that's exciting, knowing that this isn't just some kind of intellectual conversation.
Real life.
Some of these things are really helping people have a better relationship with God. That's exciting to me.
Awesome. Praise God for that. Okay. Hope asks, does the Latin Mass have any English in it? And I know the answer to this one is no.
Yeah. No. Although I do think that this was something that wasn't so terrible about the reforms, even though I have no problem with a Latin only Mass. I do think that it's good to bring in the vernacular in some cases at only some parts of the liturgy. I don't think it's a good idea to have just nothing but a vernacular liturgy. At the same time, I don't think it's evil to have nothing but a entirely vernacular liturgy. I think that we need to have maybe a little bit of a balance here. My personal opinion here, and it's perfectly fine for people to disagree. It's one of those things that we can agree to disagree on. I think anything that is addressing God in the Latin Rite, we're only talking about the Latin Rite churches here, in the Latin Rite, any part of the liturgy that is addressing God, I think it's preferable to have that in Latin. And anything that's addressing the congregation, it's preferable to have that in the vernacular.
Interesting. Okay. I mean, like in our Latin Mass, currently, and I say currently because they might be changing this. The scripture readings are read in Latin,
right? And
then the priest comes to the podium and he reads them again in English, and then he preaches the homily,
which they didn't always do historically, though. But that is the case. Yeah. But they didn't always do that historically, right. And that was something that needed some reform, because, in fact, for quite a while, the laity weren't even allowed to have that a translation of the missal, because that was sometimes being abused. So it was understandable why that was the case.
Yeah.
People were taking translations and using it for heretical purposes. So it was completely understandable why the church did it. But for a while, I mean, you wouldn't have the scripture reading read in the vernacular at all. And I think that becomes unfortunate. So there are some good developments we've seen in the Latin Mass community when it comes to some of these things.
Okay. Speaking of Orthodox, John Go here. He's Orthodox. He says, Michael, what is your spiritual life in Catholicism like versus Eastern Orthodox?
I mean, really substantially, it's not any different. A big focus of mine in Eastern Orthodoxy was the Jesus prayer, and it still is in Catholicism today. Personally, I don't think that there's any substantial differences between the Catholic version of spirituality versus the Eastern Orthodox. You might be able to make some distinctions between Latin Rite spirituality and maybe some of the Eastern Rite versions of spirituality. You can make some distinctions, but I think they're accidental. They're not substantial. So really, I haven't had any major changes there. I'm still pretty Eastern in my approach to spirituality, but very Latin when it comes to my approach of theology.
It's interesting. I'm sure that has changed a little bit here and there.
Like I'll still pray. Although sometimes in fact, today I was doing the divine office according to the Latin Rite tradition, but a lot of times I'm reading the equivalent of the Liturgy of the Hours for the Eastern Catholics. So I'll do their daily prayers and their daily readings, but then sometimes I'll do a little Latin Rite stuff. So
Okay, a couple other ones here. This is an interesting question. What is Michael's view in engaging the youth?
mm-hmm.
Because do you have youth group discussions about this kind of stuff, or
Yeah, absolutely. In
how do we
fact,
reach these kids? Because I mean, we all want to reach the kids, but do you find? I mean, I know some kids that are pretty like in this world, talking about this kind of stuff.
I've noticed, because I've seen different people who would comment on the channel, and they're not 18 yet. They'll talk about, my parents are taking me to school or something like that, and they're watching the show, and I thought, oh wow, that's cool. So people who are youth are watching the channel. So I mean, I think it's great to engage the youth, especially because I know from personal experience, if you don't really give them a good formation when they get to college, they're probably going to be seriously tempted to go elsewhere. So I think it's extremely important to engage.
Amen. I was a youth pastor for a long time, and my philosophy was treat the kids like you treat anybody. Don't talk down to them. Don't make them feel like they're second-class citizens of the church or not ready for real truth or theology or whatever because they're teenagers. I mean, I'm pretty sure that the Apostle John was a teenager when Jesus called him. So we have to do that. Thank you for that answer. Okay, this is heavy here. Okay, Manuel's Tamatilio says, "Is my baptism that was in a Novus Ordo Mass valid? How about my confirmation?"
It's assumed to be valid.
Yeah.
There are some cases where maybe a priest at a Novus Ordo parish doesn't do it validly, but it is assumed to be, because it's assumed that they're following the missal and doing things properly. But I mean, as is the case with humans, people sometimes don't do what they're supposed to do. But I mean, unless I have any more detail, I'm going to assume your baptism and your confirmation at the Novus Ordo parish is valid. It has to be proven otherwise. You assume it's valid until it's proven otherwise. If you told me that, well, my priest used Coca-Cola to baptize me, okay, yeah, that's not a valid.
Then you would know.
That's
but
not
just
valid.
Based on
just unless you're telling me something, I'm gonna assume it's valid, and you should assume it's valid unless you know something otherwise. Because if you go into this habit of starting to assume otherwise, you're going to go down a path of scrupulosity that you don't want to go down. And I know that from personal experience. You assume it's valid, and you always also assume God is merciful for whatever I may not know. Maybe my baptism wasn't valid, but I have no reason to believe it. Well, you know what? If that's the case, God is merciful, and he's going to supply and fill in the gaps. He's not going to condemn you and say on the day of judgment, you know what? Your baptism was invalid, and therefore I'm sending you to hell. And you had no way of knowing that your baptism was invalid, but I'm still sending you to hell. That's not the God we serve.
Yeah, I mean, I love the way the Catechism puts that when it says that, God is not bound by the sacraments. No. And to me, what that has helped me understand is exactly what you just said, that God can apply his grace in all these different ways, and he fills in the gaps. That's a great way. I'm going to use that, Michael. That's a great way to put that.
He supplies what's lacking.
He supplies what's lacking. Amen. Okay, I got a super chat from Victor here. Thank you so much for this chat. Do you think that the factions are a continuation of the warring that was present between religious orders, Jesuits versus Dominicans and such? That's a good question.
I'm sure there's a little bit of truth to that, but I don't think that that's substantially the case. But I mean, hey, if you prove otherwise, I'm happy to be corrected. But I don't really see them tying into those particular issues. I more see this being there's a lot of information out there now in the information age with the internet, and a lot of that information is not accurately representing the Catholic faith. So people they become very confused. And I think that is what is probably more likely to be the contribution here before a lot of these wars. There's a lot more access now to, for example, papal documents or papal encyclicals or conciliar documents. The average person can go right now online and read all of the canons of Nicaea or Ephesus or something like that, and they can read those things, and that might be good, but at the same time, if they're not trained well in theology and history, they're going to make a lot of mistakes, and that's going to then cause friction when they encounter somebody who has a different interpretation. I think that's more likely the cause behind some of these things.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, this is an interesting question here. How did the Latin Catholics deal with some Eastern Catholics having Gregory of Palamas a saint? I don't know who that is. Do you know who that is?
Sure, yeah, Saint Gregory Palamas. So he was a Eastern Orthodox.
Oh, he was an Eastern Orthodox guy.
Yeah, he's an Eastern Orthodox bishop, and then he's especially known for the distinction between essence and energies. And the Eastern Catholics bring in with their liturgy the veneration of Gregory Palamas. So he was formally outside, well, he was technically outside of communion with the Catholic Church, but he was venerated by the Eastern Orthodox. And when these Orthodox come into communion with the Catholic Church, they brought with them the veneration of Gregory Palamas. And Rome has allowed for that veneration. So I'm of the opinion that it is licit to venerate Gregory Palamas because Rome has implicitly canonized him. There have been no formal canonizations by Rome of Gregory Palamas, but by allowing him to be venerated by Eastern Catholics, who are just as much as in full communion as Latin Rite Catholics, it's an implicit acceptance of that veneration. So now what do some Latin Catholics have a problem with it? Because they think, wait, I can't do that because this guy died outside of communion with Rome. Yeah, although interestingly enough, Orthodox also have that same issue. They venerate some people who are not Eastern Orthodox, but more importantly, we can now talk about there's a distinction between formal schism and material schism. Somebody like Gregory Palamas, he was materially in schism. He wasn't in communion with the Catholic Church. Was he formally so? What was he intending to really be separated from full communion with Christ Church? No, he wasn't. So it wasn't something that he's culpable for. So it doesn't prevent him from being venerated with the approval of Rome. I would not venerate somebody who died outside of formal communion with Rome, unless Rome gives that approbation, right?
Yeah.
So there's that qualifier there. As long as Rome gives it, yes. If Rome doesn't have that approbation, I would say it would definitely be questionable.
Okay, a couple more questions. We're going to fire away here. We got a lot of good ones coming in, you guys. Okay, this is an interesting one. Why are some Catholics so hung up on ad orientem? Okay, ad orientem meaning that the priest does not face, and I mentioned this earlier, that the priest faces the east, or he faces his back is to the people. Why do you think some Catholics, and I'm one of them, I'll just admit that right now. I don't know that I'm hung up on it, but I strongly prefer that. And what about you, Michael?
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that we have versus populum, which is facing the people. I don't think it's invalid. I don't think it's evil. I definitely don't think that there is any good reason to be doing it. I think we should have ad orientem, which is that the priest and the congregation as well are facing what's called liturgical east. They're facing the east because it's actually from the east that Christ is going to return. Mm-hmm. So what it is the priest is facing Christ, if you will, because that's where he's going to come from, according to his own very words in the Gospel of Matthew. So facing liturgical east has always been our tradition. In fact, you can see Pope Benedict the 16th mentioning this in his work on the spirit of the liturgy, talking about how this is an apostolic tradition. Yeah. Now, this is an apostolic tradition that is not binding. It's not part of revelation, but it is a tradition and practice that has been in existence from the time of the apostles. And to radically shift and to say we're going to do differently, I don't think there were any good reasons to do that. And I think it is important to face liturgical east because this has been always our tradition. It's facing Christ. The priest is leading us to Christ in prayer. He
Yes.
doesn't have his back towards you. That's ridiculous.
Yep.
He's leading you to Christ. And there's just no good reason to say let's do versus populum. Whenever we do versus populum, there is a truth. There is sense in which it could begin to develop an idea that this is more of a man-centered thing rather than God-centered. So I do think it's unfortunate that we don't always do ad orientem. So that's why they get hung up on it, and I think rightly so to an extent. But I'm never going to say that unless your liturgy is ad orientem, you couldn't go to it, or it's evil, or it's sinful, or it's invalid. None of that. No.
So here's the way that it was said to me one time, and I don't remember who said it to me, but I love it. It said, when you get on an airplane, do you want the pilot facing the people in the airplane, or do you want him facing where we're going?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, done. To me, that's what it's all about. And this was something my wife actually was really drawn to coming back into the church. She's like, I feel more like I'm with the priest as he's offering this sacrifice versus like I'm watching it, which is so interesting because you would think it'd be the other way around, that if it's back to you, it's like, okay, I'm just watching this guy. I don't know what he's doing. But to us, it feels more like we're watching him when he's facing us than when he's facing away from us and we're all facing the same direction. It feels like we're all participating in it. But that's just kind of my deal. All right, we're gonna keep rocking here. We got a lot of questions. We'll try to get faster at answering them, you guys, so we can get there. And I'm not gonna be able to get all of them, but I'm gonna do the best I can. Okay, here's one. Beautiful Spirit says, question for Michael. Do you think we should have a more structured / substantial preparation from the sacrament of marriage? Does the Eastern Church offer more preparation?
In my experience, I haven't seen a whole lot of preparation in the Latin Rite. And, I also haven't seen a whole lot when it comes to the Eastern Catholics. It doesn't mean it's not there. I'm just saying from what I have seen. So I would like to see more marriage preparation all around.
Amen. All right. Catholic Ben Shapiro. My wife loves your name, by the way. What do you think of a single mass replacing the Novus Ordo and TLM masses? What should replace these? I hope that doesn't happen. I guess, part of me thinks it'd be awesome if there was just one mass. I'll be honest with you. I'll just throw that out there. I do think that would be awesome. But I'm not going to say what it is. That's above my pay grade to say that. But I don't think we should like scrap both things and come up with something new to try to smash them together. And because I don't think that's what they would do anyway. But I'm going to kind of say, I don't think that's a good idea personally. Michael, you want to weigh in on that? Do you have an idea? Or
ideally it would be better if there were only one form of the Latin Rite. But right now, are we in an environment in the Catholic Church, in the Latin Rite, where we could somehow do that and not scandalize people? If we were to take away the Latin Mass right now and just morph it into something else, it's going to scandalize so many people. We've already had enough of that. We've already had enough liturgical changes. As much as I would like to see one form, and as much as I would like to see some reforms of the Latin Mass, I don't believe this is the right time. This is probably the worst time for us to maybe do something like that because it's just going to confuse people even more. So maybe in 100 or 200 years from now. But here's the thing. I'm not of the opinion that any of this should be done by a committee or unilaterally. This ideal of having one form of the Latin Rite needs to be something that organically happens over a long period of time. And I do believe that's going to happen. I do believe if you were to look 300 years right now into the Latin Rite, if the Lord tarries that long, I think you would probably see one form of the Roman Rite, and it would be kind of a blend of some aspects from the two. And it would have hopefully have happened organically, just over time. It would grow into something like that, and you wouldn't have this split. But the last thing we need is for a pope to get a committee and start making, huge changes and causing more rupture, whether it's for good or bad. That was what got us in this mess, was revising liturgy according to committees. And this is another thing. The liturgy is not our plaything. we have an obligation to hand down what has been to future generations, what has been handed down to us. And this mentality that we can get into a committee and start to reform the liturgy through these unilateral changes, I'm not sure that was the best idea. I think practically it's the case. We're saying that it wasn't a good idea.
Okay, so I guess what we're both kind of saying is, in philosophical terms, we think that would be awesome if there was just one mass, but the practical realities of how they would pull that off or what that would look like right now, it's beyond my ability to foresee.
Right. Yeah, I don't see it happening. Yeah.
Here's another super chat from Django here. Remember, he's our Orthodox brother. Michael, if East and West were united, what in your mind would it take from each side to make that happen? I love that question, by the way. I think that's
really
awesome.
Good question. Well, the Latin writer, of course, I should say the Pope himself, he's going to probably need to be a little less involved in the affairs of the Eastern bishops than maybe he would in some of the affairs of a Latin Rite bishop. On the Eastern end, they're going to need to affirm the fact that he has that right to intervene in their affairs, that he has immediate ordinary jurisdiction. But just because he has that right doesn't mean that he should always exercise it. As a father, just because you have authority over your children doesn't mean that you should always just strong arm them into doing what they're supposed to do. You could, but is that the best approach in all cases? In some cases, that's probably not the best way. So the Eastern Orthodox need to recognize the position of the papacy and his ability to intervene in the affairs of a jurisdiction. They need to recognize that has been given to us by Christ. At the same time, the Pope probably needs to exercise charity before he exercises that in the matters in an Eastern diocese, I would say.
I always wondered, like, who would have the tougher time in that unification process? Would the Eastern Church or the Eastern, not Eastern Church, would the Eastern Orthodox or the Roman Latin Church? You know,
the East, because the East would actually have to basically affirm a dogma that they've been denying, that they've been considering heretical. Whereas the Catholic Church, we don't have to change any dogmas. We just need to change practically how we would relate to them. There's not as much of a change for the Pope. There's a whole lot more change for them because they have to now affirm a dogma they didn't maintain before. Moreover, they now also have to affirm the Immaculate Conception as dogma, the Filioque as dogma. They might not necessarily have to express them or use it in the creed, but they would have to recognize, theoretically speaking, I mean, just objectively speaking, these are dogmatic. They would have to recognize that if they're going to be in full communion. So it's a bigger jump for them than it is for us.
Makes sense. Okay, a couple more here. AB says, can you be both Novus Ordo and traditionalist, or do you have to be one or the other?
I think you can be both. I mean, I go to a Novus Ordo parish, so I think that you can be both. I think that there's some things about the Latin Mass that are more preferable than the Novus Ordo. I also think that there are some things that came out of the post-conciliar reform to the liturgy that are more preferable than they are in the Tridentine Mass. And so I think you can be both.
Yeah.
Now, if you put a gun to my head and said, which one would I rather attend on average right now? I would rather attend a Latin Mass because on average, they tend to be done better than your average Novus Ordo. But I don't think that you have to choose between those.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I'm at the Latin Mass probably 95% of the time, but every once in a while I go to the Novus Ordo and I don't feel like I've just done something terrible, you know?
Right.
Interesting. Okay, guys, we're going to have just time for just a couple more questions. I apologize to those of you that have had questions that I didn't get to. I'm having to, you guys, a ton of them, but I'm trying to stick with the ones that I feel like are most on topic. And we just don't have time for everything because Michael's doing another live stream tonight.
Yeah, going to be doing another one a little bit, addressing some of the liberal arguments that I've been seeing.
All right, here we go. So here's another super chat from Miller Family CR. Older people say after attending the traditional Latin Mass, they didn't get anything out of it. My reply, it's about offering glory, adoration, and thanksgiving, and trying God along with our atonement and petition for aims of mice. Is that a good response? I think that's a good response.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, It's not about your preference and what you like. The question is what is best and what is really in keeping with the traditions that have been handed down to us. I think that's a better way of I would never say, well, I just get more out of this than the other. Who cares? I mean, what is the right thing? I mean, what should we be doing? Those are the better questions. So I agree with you. I think that was a good response that you gave.
I think that's a great question to kind of end this portion on, you guys, because that's about, really the point for all of us is to recognize that as Catholics, that's what we're supposed to be. Whether you consider yourself a traditional Catholic or not, whatever, and I don't know what the alternative is, to be honest with you. If you're a Catholic and you love Jesus and you love his church, then you should recognize that that's exactly what Mass is about. It's about offering glory, adoration, and thanksgiving to our triune God and recognizing, and like she says, the atonement petition for our sins. This is the point. This is the center. This is the gospel. And we can get sometimes too wrapped up in some of these other things that we miss the whole point of what this is all about, because we're too going, oh man, am I doing this the right way or that the right way? Or is that guy doing the wrong thing? Or am I in the wrong Mass? Or did I say the wrong deal? Or is that person not the right person or whatever? Friends, at the end of the day, remember this. This is about worshiping God, not about our own preferences or our own, tribal affiliations with all that. So that's just kind of my take on it. So, Michael, talk to us just briefly here. Tell us a little bit more about where people can find out more stuff about you and Reason and Theology and some stuff you got coming up.
Yeah. So just go to YouTube, type in Reason and Theology. You'll see the channel there. And of course, you can go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see the website where it has more information about the show. It has podcasts that you could subscribe to if you want to listen to it in the form of a podcast, and also additional articles on there. So, a lot of people don't know. They just think we're YouTube only. No, we have some articles as well. So check those out too. And, some of the things that are coming up, I know Bishop Strickland is going to be on in the next few days. So, awesome. Looking forward to having him on.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I want to thank you for taking this time. I got to go on your channel a couple weeks ago. I really enjoyed that. And I know that this has been an awesome discussion and I know there are people that are like, oh, we didn't get to talk about this or that or whatever. The guys, there's so many rabbit trails we could go down with this, but I really wanted to keep it from like a basic philosophical understanding of what is this whole thing with traditional Catholicism. And I know there's so many more things we could say, but when we think about it ultimately, friends, remember this. Traditional Catholicism, any Catholicism, has to be rooted in obedience to Christ and in his church. And that's what we're here to do and to live out in our lives. And let's remember to do that with charity, with grace, with humility, and with, get this, joy. Joy. Why isn't there a tribe called Joy Trads? We should start that.
I've seen glad trads before.
Glad trads? Okay.
There's mad trads and there's
mad trads, red trads. Okay, maybe glad trads is what I'm talking about then, but I don't know. I like joy trads better. I want to start my own thing. Michael Lofton, everybody, thank you so much for being here. Check out Reason and Theology. And friends, I want to thank all of you for joining us here on Catholic Feedback. It's been an absolute blast to have you. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for keeping it reasonable and charitable for the most part in the chat and respectful. That's very important to me. God bless all of you guys. And I look forward to seeing you back here next time on Catholic Feedback. Thanks for listening to Catholic Feedback with Keith Nestor. Send in your questions and comments to feedback@catholicfeedback.com. This podcast is brought to you by Stewardship, a mission of faith, and is also supported by our team at patreon.com/Keith Nestor. Please consider joining our support team. Catholic Feedback is a production of Down to Earth Ministries. For more information about Down to Earth or to bring me to your parish or event, visit down2earthministry.org. See you next time.